Okay, so we've talked quite a bit about North Bay resources on this show.
Yeah.
We've taken some deep dives into their projects before, and I think our listeners are probably pretty familiar with them by now. But today, we're going to zero in on one project in particular. That would be their Copper Island project, which is in British Columbia.
Yeah. Sounds good.
And the reason we're looking at Copper Island specifically today is there's I think, some interesting news coming out. I think it was just last month, February 2025.
Right.
They put out a news release all about the latest exploration work that's been happening. And like we always do, we try to keep our listeners as informed as possible, make things kind of easy to digest. So our plan is to really break down what are the key findings, what's important here, without getting too bogged down in all the jargon and the weeds of the mining industry.
Right.
So I guess just jumping right in, what are some of the things that stand out to you from these new results?
Well, the first thing that really jumps out at you is just the high-grade discoveries. They're
Uh,
seeing some pretty impressive results from the recent rock sampling program. So, instead of having to drill, they can just walk up to these areas and take samples.
yeah, right.
And they focused on a few different areas, the Pomeroy 1 through 3 zones, the Beaver zone, and the Copper Bell area. And some of these samples are showing some really impressive grades.
Like how high are we talking?
Well, they're reporting up to 5.69% copper.
Wow.
Yeah. And in addition to that, they're also seeing up to 1 ounce of silver per ton and up to 0.22% vanadium in these samples as well.
Okay, so we can get a sense of, is this just a tiny little spot where they found this really high grade, or is this something more substantial? What are the averages looking like?
Right. You always want to see that the high grades aren't just an anomaly.
Right.
You want to see that it's part of a bigger mineralized system. And the average grades across all the samples are also really encouraging. They're reporting an average of 4.6% copper, zero point 0.5 ounces per ton silver, and 0.9% vanadium.
Okay, so consistent, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. When you see averages like that, it suggests that the mineralization is more widespread. And that could be a good sign for the overall size of the deposit.
So, just thinking about our listeners here, why is that important? If there's good averages, that could mean what for the future of this project?
Well, it basically means that there's a greater chance that this could actually become a mine someday. You need to have a certain amount of material that's economic to actually be worth the cost of building a mine. So if they're seeing these consistent grades over a larger area, it's just a more promising sign.
Right. It could be a big mine. It could be an economically viable project down the road.
Exactly.
Okay, so now I want to touch on something that I thought was really interesting in the news release.
Yeah.
They talk a bit about the type of copper that they're finding. And they mentioned that a significant portion of it appears to be in what's called oxide form.
Right.
And I think it's helpful to maybe explain to our listeners, why is that important? Why should we care if it's oxide versus some other form of copper?
Yeah.
What's the significance there?
Yeah, so the type of copper mineralization can have a big impact on how you would actually extract it from the ground and how much it costs to do so. The more traditional way to process copper ores, especially sulfide ores, is through smelting. And smelting, it involves these huge furnaces. It's really energy intensive, can be expensive, and can have a significant environmental impact.
Right. Okay.
Now, copper oxides, on the other hand, they can often be processed using a different method called leaching.
Okay. And is leaching better than smelting, I guess?
Yeah, generally speaking, leaching tends to be a lot simpler and a lot less energy intensive. It involves using a chemical solution to essentially dissolve the copper from the ore, and then you can recover that copper from the solution.
Oh, I see.
So if a significant portion of the copper at Copper Island is in this oxide form, it could mean that they can use these cheaper, more environmentally friendly processing methods.
Okay, so this is potentially good news for North Bay if they can confirm that, a lot of the copper there is in this oxide form. It could be cheaper to extract. It could be more environmentally friendly.
Exactly. And they actually did some testing to determine just how much of the copper is in this oxide form. They did what are called metallurgical studies.
Okay.
And they found that the oxide copper content varies quite a bit. In some samples, it was as high as 74.4%, but the average across the 3 different leach tests they ran was between about 40 and 58%.
Okay, so that's a pretty decent chunk of it.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So it's not all oxide copper, but it's a significant enough portion that it could definitely make a difference in the economics of the project.
Okay, so we've talked about these results. We've talked about the oxide copper. let's maybe take a step back and remind our listeners about Copper Island itself. We've talked about it before on the show, but just to kind of give people some context, where is this project located?
Right. So Copper Island, it's located near Campbell River,
Which is in British Columbia.
British Columbia, yeah, on the coast.
On the coast.
And it's actually not too far from North Bay's other copper project, the Murex Copper Project.
Right, okay.
So they've got they're developing a bit of a hub there in that region.
And we've talked before about the geology in that area. How does that play into what they're finding at Copper Island?
Yeah, so the geology is really important here. So the Copper Island area is underlain by what are called Kermutsen volcanics.
Okay, so for our listener, volcanics, these are volcanic rocks.
Yeah, exactly. Ancient volcanic rocks. And what's important about these volcanic rocks is they're often highly fractured. They've been broken up over time by various geological processes. And these fractures can act as pathways for mineralizing fluids to flow through and deposit copper and other metals. And these fractures are often filled with other minerals like calcite and quartz, which is something that they're seeing at Copper Island as well. So the geology is really setting things up nicely for these types of copper deposits.
Right, okay. So the type of rock in the area is the kind of rock that often hosts copper. And then in addition to that, they're finding all these fractures and cracks, and that's like extra good.
Yeah, exactly. And they've actually identified specific copper-bearing minerals within those rocks. The primary one they're seeing is called chalcocite.
Okay.
And chalcocite, it's a copper sulfide mineral, but it often forms as a result of changes to other earlier formed copper minerals.
Okay, so like it kind of transformed from something else.
Right, yeah. And they're also seeing other copper minerals as well, but in smaller amounts. Things like bornite, cuprate, malachite, and even native copper.
Wow, native copper. So that's like pure copper just sitting in the rock.
Yeah, exactly. You can just find it, like little nuggets of copper just sitting there.
Wow, that's cool.
And they're finding that especially in areas where the rocks have been exposed to weathering and oxidation, and they noted that those higher grade zones tend to have chalcocite replacing some of the original volcanic rock structures.
I see. So that's interesting. It gives us a sense of, how the deposit formed and why the copper is concentrated in those specific areas.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, I know we talked about this before, but they also mentioned briefly the potential for vanadium.
Right, yeah.
Which is something that they've been kind of talking about for a while. It sounds like they're still kind of keeping an eye on that as well.
Yeah, they mentioned that historically vanadium has been identified in a layer above the copper mineralization. And it's believed to be what's called acid leachable.
Okay. And I guess what that means is that you could potentially extract it using a similar leaching process to what we were talking about with the copper oxides.
Right, exactly.
Okay. So it's not the primary focus right now, but it's something that could add additional value to the project down the road if they can figure out a way to economically extract it.
Right.
Okay. So now I want to dive into a specific area of the project that they seem to be focusing a lot on in this news release, and that's the Pomeroy 3-4 zone. Why is this zone so important?
Right. Well, they've been able to trace the copper mineralization in the Pomeroy 3-4 zone over a considerable length. They say it's about 750 feet long.
Wow, so that's pretty big.
Yeah, it is.
And that makes it the largest of the identified copper-silver zones on the property so far.
Exactly. And it trends in a northwest to north direction. And they think it's associated with some major cross faults and fracture zones.
Okay. And just for our listener, faults, those are kind of breaks in the Earth's crust, right?
Exactly, yeah. And those breaks can create pathways for these copper-rich fluids to flow through.
Okay, I see.
So it looks like these faults and fractures played a really key role in where the copper ended up.
So not only do you have the right type of rock, but then you have these major breaks in the rock that kind of act as channels for the copper to flow through and then deposit itself.
Right, exactly. And it's not just the Pomeroy zone that's showing promise. There are other mineralized zones on the property as well.
Right. Yeah, they list a bunch of them.
Yeah.
Copper Valley, Butte, Copper Bell, Colleen, Vanadium, and Ingersoll. It sounds like these are all showing signs of mineralization as well.
Yeah, and they have some common characteristics. They often show increased quartz and calcite veining.
Which is something we talked about earlier, right?
Right. And copper sulfides in these altered and fractured zones. And some of these zones are pretty wide. They can actually see them on the surface.
Right. So, it's not just one little spot. It's like this whole network of mineralized zones.
Yeah, exactly.
And we know this isn't the first time that people have explored for copper at Copper Island.
Oh, yeah. Definitely not
There's
too.
been a lot of historical work there.
Right. They actually mentioned some of the past work in the news release.
Okay.
So there were drilling programs by Dodge Copper in the 1950s
Wow.
and Prince Stewart Mines Limited in the 1970s. And this work actually led to some historical resource estimates.
Okay, so resource estimates, those are basically calculations of how much copper might be there, right?
Exactly. But it's important to remember that these estimates are historical. They were done before the current standards we have today, what's called NI 43-101. So while they're interesting to look at, we can't really rely on them the same way we would on a more recent estimate.
Right. They're not as reliable,
Yeah.
but they do tell us that people have been interested in this area for a long time.
Right, exactly.
It makes me think back to those results from the 2023 exploration program, which we did discuss. Those were showing some really high grades as well.
Right, from the Pomeroy and Copper Bell zones.
Yeah, yeah.
So it seems like this new data is just confirming and expanding on what they were already seeing.
Yeah. And they actually included a table in the news release with all those historical resource estimates from the BC Ministry of Mines.
Right.
For all the different zones on the property. Pomeroy 1 through 5, Beaver 1 Hall, Copper Bell 1+2. They list the tonnage, they list the copper percentage. And again, these are historical numbers, so take them with a grain of salt. But it just gives you a sense of the scale of what they were thinking might be there.
Yeah, exactly.
And the last thing I want to point out is that, they did have a qualified person review all of this information.
Right.
Which is important. Right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's standard practice.
It was Andres Kakaka. He's a PGO. So he's gone through it. He's checked all the technical information, make sure everything's accurate. And that gives us, as investors, a bit more confidence in what we're reading.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's bring it all together for our listeners. We've gone through a lot of information here. What would you say is the big takeaway from this latest deep dive into these assay results?
I would say that the big takeaway is that these results are very encouraging. They're seeing those high grades, they're seeing consistent grades, and that oxide copper is really a potentially game changer for this project.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it could make a big difference in terms of the economics. And for our listeners, the people who really want to stay informed, but they also want to be efficient with their time, this deep dive gives you that really concentrated understanding of what's happening at Copper Island.
Exactly.
So, with these new results in mind and everything else we know about the project, I guess the question now is what's next? What should our listeners be watching for? What are those milestones that could really give us more insight into the future of Copper Island?
Yeah, well, I think the next logical step would be to see some more drilling. They need to confirm these results at depth. See how extensive these zones really are, get a better handle on the overall size and grade of the deposit.
Right.
And then once they have more data from drilling, they can start to work towards that all-important feasibility study.
Right. Okay.
Which will really tell us if this project has the potential to become a mine.
Right. Okay. So lots to watch for.
Definitely, yeah.
And as always, we'll keep our listeners updated as things develop. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into North Bay Resources and their Copper Island project.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.